The bitter Montana wind howled across the platform as Eleanor Blackwood clutched her threadbare coat tighter around her tall frame. 6 feet of disappointment. That's what her mother used to call her. The train whistle pierced the winter air, signaling the final stop on her 3-day journey. Whitefish, Montana, a place she'd pinned all her desperate hopes on. Final stop! Whitefish! The conductor called, his voice nearly lost in the swirling snow. Eleanor's heart pounded against her ribs as she gathered her single battered suitcase. 6 months of correspondence with Thomas Whitley had led to this moment. A fresh start as the wife of a frontier businessman who needed a practical woman of good breeding to help run his mercantile and bring respectability to his establishment. His letters had been formal but kind. His photograph showed a handsome man with serious eyes and a well-trimmed mustache. What his letters hadn't asked for was her height. Standing a full 6 feet tall in her stockings, Eleanor towered over most men, a fact that had made her a curiosity in Philadelphia and utterly unmarriageable by 27. When the advertisement seeking mail-order brides for Montana businessmen appeared in the newspaper, she'd seized the opportunity with both hands. Now, stepping down onto the snow-covered platform, Eleanor scanned the waiting faces. A cluster of men stood huddled against the cold, some holding small signs with names. Her eyes found a man matching Thomas's photograph. He stood slightly apart from the others, his expression shifting from anticipation to visible shock as she approached. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you, Mr. Whitley. Eleanor forced herself to smile, despite the familiar sinking feeling in her stomach. She'd seen that expression before, the widening eyes, the quick step backward, the embarrassed glance around to see who was watching. Thomas cleared his throat, his gaze fixed somewhere around her collar. Miss Blackwood, you're not... That is to say, yes, I am rather tall, she finished for him, her voice steady despite the humiliation burning her cheeks. I believe your advertisement requested a woman of good breeding and practical disposition. I assure you I am both. Thomas swallowed hard, tugging at his collar. Miss Blackwood, perhaps we should discuss this in private. My wagon is this way. The ride to town was painfully silent, broken only by the crunch of snow beneath the wagon wheels and the occasional snort from the horses. Thomas stared straight ahead, his knuckles white on the reins. Eleanor kept her spine rigid, refusing to slouch, as she'd been tempted to do so many times before. Miss Blackwood, Thomas finally spoke as they reached the outskirts of town, I find myself in an awkward position. You find the arrangement unsuitable, Eleanor stated flatly. She'd prepared herself for this possibility, but preparation did little to dull the sting. It's not that you aren't a fine woman, I'm sure, Thomas stammered, still not meeting her eyes. But in my position as the town's most prominent merchant, appearances are, that is to say, a man should not be overshadowed by his wife. Overshadowed. The word hung in the frigid air between them. The townsfolk would talk. It would affect business. Thomas had the decency to look ashamed. I've arranged a room for you at Mrs. Holloway's boarding house. I'll cover the cost for 2 weeks, which should give you time to make other arrangements. Eleanor's carefully constructed hopes crumbled around her. She'd spent nearly every penny on the train ticket west. There was no money for a return journey, no family eagerly awaiting her return, no position held for her at the millinery where she'd worked for 8 thankless years. I see, was all she trusted herself to say. Thomas pulled the wagon to a stop outside a neat 2-story house with a weathered sign reading Holloway's Boarding House. For what it's worth, I am sorry, he said, finally looking directly at her. I should have, that is, I didn't think to ask. No, you didn't, Eleanor agreed, climbing down from the wagon with as much dignity as she could muster. She retrieved her suitcase before he could offer, unwilling to accept even that small courtesy. Inside the boarding house, Mrs. Holloway, a stout woman with sharp eyes and a surprisingly kind smile, showed Eleanor to a small but clean room on the second floor. "Mail order bride?" Mrs. Holloway asked bluntly once they were alone. Eleanor nodded, unable to form words around the lump in her throat. "Thomas Whitley?" Another nod. Mrs. Holloway sighed. "That man has more pride than sense. Not the first bride. He's turned away, though usually it's for reasons less obvious." Eleanor sank onto the edge of the narrow bed. "What am I to do now?" Mrs. Holloway studied her with shrewd eyes. "You've got 2 weeks. That's time enough to find work at least. This town's full of men who need wives, women who need help, and businesses that need capable hands. Not all of them are as short-sighted as Thomas Whitley." After Mrs. Holloway left, Eleanor finally allowed the tears to come, not the delicate ladylike tears her mother had always scolded her for lacking, but deep, wrenching sobs that left her gasping. She'd gambled everything on this journey. Now, she was stranded in a mountain town where she knew no one, with limited funds and no prospects. The next morning, Eleanor rose early, washed her face in the basin of cold water, and pinned her dark hair into a severe bun. She wore her plainest dress, a navy wool that, like all her clothing, fell just a bit short at the ankles. In the small mirror above the washstand, she practiced a smile that showed none of yesterday's humiliation. At breakfast, Mrs. Holloway introduced her to the only other current boarder, a narrow-faced schoolteacher named Miss Perkins, who barely reached Eleanor's shoulder and regarded her with undisguised curiosity. "I've never seen a woman of your stature," Miss Perkins remarked, stirring her tea. "Yes, well, now you have," Eleanor replied evenly, buttering a slice of toast. "It must be difficult," Miss Perkins continued, "finding suitable employment, or suitors. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I managed both in Philadelphia, Eleanor said, though the truth was considerably more complicated. I expect I shall do so here as well." Mrs. Holloway snorted. "Good for you, dear. The mercantile's hiring, though I doubt. Thomas would have the spine to employ you after yesterday. The sawmill needs an accountant, and the school could use an assistant, assuming," she glanced at Miss Perkins, "the current teacher doesn't object to being overshadowed." Miss Perkins flushed but said nothing. Eleanor spent the morning walking through town, introducing herself to business owners. At the mercantile, the bell above the door announced her entrance, and Thomas emerged from the back room, freezing mid-step when he saw her. "Miss Blackwood," he managed. "I didn't expect—" "I've come to inquire about the shop assistant position," Eleanor cut in, her voice professional. "Mrs. Holloway mentioned you were hiring. That is, the position has been filled." Thomas stammered. Eleanor nodded, unsurprised. "I see. Good day then, Mr. Whitley." As she turned to leave, the door opened, bringing with it a blast of cold air and the most imposing man Eleanor had ever encountered. He ducked to enter the mercantile, his broad shoulders nearly filling the doorframe. Eleanor found herself looking directly into eyes the color of a winter sky, icy blue and startlingly direct. For a moment, neither moved. Then the mountain of a man stepped aside, permitting her to pass. "Thank you," Eleanor murmured, oddly unsettled by the intensity of his gaze. Outside, she paused to catch her breath, watching through the window as the giant of a man handed Thomas a list. Unlike the other townspeople she'd encountered, who stared, whispered, or hurriedly looked away, this stranger had regarded her with something that felt remarkably like recognition. By mid-afternoon, Eleanor had been turned away from the sawmill. Bookkeeping was men's work. The apothecary, customers would be uncomfortable, and the hotel, she would frighten the guests. She stood in the middle of the snow-covered street, exhaustion and hunger gnawing at her resolve. The diner across the street looked warm, lights glowing invitingly against the gathering dusk. Eleanor counted the coins in her purse. She could afford a simple meal just this once. Inside, the diner was half full, mostly with men stopping for an early dinner after work. Conversations stuttered to a halt as she entered, then resumed in hushed tones. Eleanor kept her chin high as she took a seat at the counter. "What can I get you, honey?" the waitress asked, a woman in her 50s with faded blonde hair and tired eyes. "Just soup, please, and coffee." "New in town?" the waitress asked, pouring the coffee. "Yes, Eleanor Blackwood, Mabel Lewis." The waitress slid the coffee across the counter. "You're staying at Holloway's, I hear." News travelled fast in small towns. "For 2 weeks, yes," Mabel nodded thoughtfully. "Looking for work, I expect. Not much for women around here." "So I've discovered." Just then, the door opened, bringing another gust of cold air and the mountain man from the mercantile. A hush fell over the diner once again, but this time, Eleanor realized, it wasn't for her. "Evening, Caleb," Mabel called out, the only one who seemed comfortable addressing him. "Usual?" The man, Caleb, nodded once, taking a seat at the far end of the counter, his back to the wall. Eleanor couldn't help but steal glances at him. He was even larger up close, well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that strained the seams of his worn canvas coat. A thick beard covered the lower half of his face, and long dark hair was tied back at the nape of his neck. Despite his intimidating size, he moved with a surprising grace, his calloused hands gentle with the delicate coffee cup. Eleanor realized he was watching her, just as intently. Their eyes met again, and something passed between them. A current of understanding that made her breath catch. Mabel returned with Eleanor's soup, following her gaze to where Caleb sat. A slow smile spread across the waitress's weathered face. "That's Caleb Wolfe," she said quietly. "He doesn't say much, lives up in the mountains, comes to town once a month for supplies. Best tracker and hunter these parts have ever seen." Eleanor nodded, forcing her attention back to her soup. "Everyone seems wary of him." "People fear what they don't understand," Mabel replied with a shrug. "Caleb keeps to himself. Has a cabin up near Glacier Lake. Some say he's half wild himself." When Eleanor glanced up again, Caleb was gone, though she hadn't heard him leave. His coffee cup was on the counter with payment beneath it. "Like I said," Mabel chuckled. "Moves quiet for a big man." Later that night, as Eleanor prepared for bed, a knock came at her door. Mrs. Holloway stood in the hallway, holding a folded piece of paper. "This came for you," she said, curiosity evident in her voice. "A boy delivered it just now." Eleanor unfolded the paper, revealing a message in a strong, surprisingly elegant hand. "If you seek employment, I require assistance with correspondence and accounts. Cabin at North Trail, 3 miles past the ridge marker. Inquire at Lewis Diner. For directions if interested. Payment fair, lodging separate. C. Wolfe." Eleanor read the note twice, her heart beating faster. An offer, the first real opportunity since her arrival. "Well?" Mrs. Holloway prompted. "It seems," Eleanor said slowly, "that I may have found work after all." The older woman peered at the signature, and her eyebrows shot up. "Caleb Wolfe, the mountain man? Child, nobody goes up to his place, especially not a woman alone." "This woman might," Eleanor replied, folding the note carefully and placing it on the nightstand. Outside her window, snow had begun to fall again, blanketing the town in white. Somewhere in the darkness beyond, up in the mountains, a man who had looked at her without flinching awaited her answer. For the first time since arriving in Whitefish, Eleanor felt something other than despair. It was a dangerous feeling, a feeling like hope. Dawn broke over Whitefish with the harsh clarity of mountain light. Eleanor stared at Caleb Wolfe's note, which she'd read so many times the creases had begun to wear thin. The offer represented something rare, opportunity without judgment. "You're not actually considering it," Miss Perkins said over breakfast, her narrow face pinched with disapproval. "A single woman in a mountain man's cabin? Think of your reputation." "My reputation," Eleanor replied, stirring honey into her tea, "has consisted mainly of being too tall for proper society. I find I can bear its further deterioration." Mrs. Holloway snorted appreciatively. "Still, it's 3 miles past civilization, girl. Winter in these mountains isn't kind to the unprepared." Outside, frost etched intricate patterns on the windows. As Eleanor weighed her dwindling options, 2 days of searching had yielded nothing but closed doors and pitying glances. "Does he have a bad reputation?" Eleanor asked. "Beyond being solitary, I mean." The women exchanged glances. "No," Mrs. Holloway admitted. "Pays his debts, helps when asked, never causes trouble. But there's something different about him. Folks say he came west after the war, hasn't spoken more than 10 words together since." "The war?" Eleanor's interest sharpened. "War changes men," Mrs. Holloway said simply. "Some wounds don't show." Eleanor nodded, decision crystallizing. "I need proper boots and a warm coat. Is there anywhere besides the Mercantile?" An hour later, she pushed open the door to Mabel's diner, the bell announcing her arrival. The lunch crowd had thinned, leaving only a few patrons nursing coffee. Mabel looked up from wiping tables, surprise flickering across her face. "Well, look who's back," she said, gesturing Eleanor toward the counter. "Coffee, please." Eleanor settled onto a stool, savoring the warmth after the biting cold outside. "I need directions to Caleb Wolfe's cabin." Mabel's hand paused mid-pour. "So you're taking him up on his offer?" "You knew about it? Who do you think suggested you?" Mabel placed the steaming mug before Eleanor. "Caleb comes in, sits right where you're sitting now. I mentioned we had a new woman in town looking for work. First time I've seen him take interest in anything beyond his usual business." Eleanor wrapped her fingers around the warm mug. "Mrs. Holloway says he rarely speaks." "Not with words, maybe." Mabel leaned against the counter. "But those who pay attention can hear him just fine. What do you know about him?" "Nothing, except he needs an assistant for correspondence and accounts." Mabel nodded. "He supplies half the territory with game and furs. Trading posts from here to Helena know his mark. Business has grown faster than his comfort with people. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." "Will you tell me how to find him?" Eleanor asked. Instead of answering, Mabel called to the kitchen, "Jim, mind the front." Then she untied her apron. "Better yet, I'll show you. My boy can run the afternoon shift." 20 minutes later, Eleanor, and found herself in Mabel's wagon, heading north out of town. The road narrowed as they climbed, pine trees heavy with snow closing in on either side. The silence here was different, not the awkward hush that fell when Eleanor entered a room, but something ancient and profound. "Most folks avoid these trails in winter," Mabel said, guiding the horses around a bend. "But Caleb keeps them clear enough. Marks the dangerous spots, too." They passed a ridge of bare rock, its face scarred with symbols carved deep enough to remain visible despite the snow. Mabel pointed. "Trail markers. Old Indian signs, some of Caleb's own making. Tells you what's ahead. Game trails, water sources, dangerous ground." "He reads these?" Eleanor asked, studying the mysterious carvings. "Reads them, makes them, respects them. Caleb may live apart, but he's connected to these mountains in ways townsfolk don't understand." The trail narrowed further, forcing the horses to a careful walk. Eleanor's city-bred sense of direction was thoroughly lost, but Mabel navigated confidently. occasionally pointing out landmarks invisible to Eleanor's untrained eye. "There," Mabel finally said, as they rounded a bend to reveal a clearing. Eleanor's breath caught. A substantial log cabin stood against the backdrop of towering pines, smoke curling from its stone chimney. Though isolated, nothing about it suggested neglect. The clearing was meticulously maintained, wood piles neatly stacked and covered, a small outbuilding to one side. Beyond the cabin, mountains rose in jagged succession, their peaks disappearing into clouds. "It's beautiful," Eleanor whispered. "Wait till you see inside," Mabel replied with a knowing smile. "Caleb Wolfe may not speak much, but his hands are never idle." As they approached, Eleanor noted a smaller cabin set apart from the main structure. "Is that your quarters, if you accept?" Mabel confirmed. "He built it last summer, had it in mind to hire help even then." The door to the main cabin opened before they reached it. Caleb emerged, a massive figure against the weathered logs. He'd removed his heavy coat, revealing broad shoulders tapering to a lean waist. His beard was neatly trimmed, not wild as town gossip suggested, and his dark hair pulled back revealed a face of stark, unexpected beauty, marred only by a jagged scar running from his right temple to jaw. "Mabel," he acknowledged with a nod. His voice a deep rumble, unused but not unpleasant. "Brought your potential assistant," Mabel announced, helping Eleanor down from the wagon. "Though I still say you should have provided transportation." Caleb's eyes, that startling winter blue, met Eleanor's. For a long moment, he studied her, not with the town's discomfort or curiosity, but with straightforward assessment. "You came," he finally said. "I did," Eleanor replied, standing her full height, refusing to hunch even as the cold penetrated her inadequate coat. Caleb's gaze flickered to her thin shoes, already soaked through with snow. Without comment, he turned and re-entered the cabin, leaving the door open behind him. "That's an invitation," Mabel explained quietly. "He's not one for unnecessary words. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. Inside, the cabin's warmth enveloped Eleanor like an embrace. Golden light from oil lamps and the crackling fire revealed a space both utilitarian and unexpectedly refined. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled to capacity with volumes whose worn spines suggested frequent use. A massive desk occupied the far corner, buried under ledgers and correspondence. Animal pelts covered the plank floors, and a stone hearth dominated the central wall. Caleb gestured toward a chair by the fire, then disappeared through a side door. Eleanor sank gratefully into the seat, extending her frozen feet toward the flames. "Not what you expected?" Mabel asked, amusement coloring her voice as she noted Eleanor's surprise. "Not entirely," Eleanor admitted. Town gossip had painted Caleb as half-wild, his cabin little more than a hunter's rough shelter. This orderly, book-filled space told a different story. Caleb returned with a pair of thick woolen socks and fur-lined boots, setting them wordlessly beside Eleanor. "For now," he explained when she hesitated, "proper gear required here." The brief sentence seemed to exhaust his verbal resources. He moved to the desk, beckoning Eleanor to follow once she'd exchanged her sodden footwear for the warm, dry alternatives. Ledgers lay open across the surface, alongside stacks of correspondence, some unopened, others responded to in that same elegant handwriting Eleanor had noted in his message. A map covered one wall, marked with routes, dates, and figures. "My business," Caleb said, gesturing to the materials. "Growing." Eleanor studied the nearest ledger, quickly grasping the systematic but overwhelmed accounting system. "You supply game and furs throughout the region?" A nod. "And you need someone to manage correspondence, maintain accounts, and track orders," she guessed, noting the haphazard stack of requests. Another nod, followed by a gesture that encompassed the desks. "Chaos. I can help with this," Eleanor said confidently. In Philadelphia, she'd not only worked as a milliner, but had kept the shop's books when the owner's eyesight began to fail. For the first time, tension eased from Caleb's powerful frame. He pulled a sheet of paper from a drawer, pushing it across the desk. Eleanor read a carefully prepared list of duties, hours, and compensation. The pay was generous, far better than anything she could have hoped for in town. "Room, board, and salary," she confirmed, surprised by the comprehensiveness of the offer. "Work is valuable," Caleb stated simply. Eleanor read further, noting the clear boundaries. Separate quarters in the smaller cabin, meals taken together for efficiency, Sundays free, monthly trips to town for supplies and personal needs. "You'll want to see your quarters?" Mabel prompted, when Eleanor remained silent, considering. The small cabin was a short walk from the main house. Though compact, it proved comfortable and thoughtfully equipped. A bed with thick quilts, a small desk, a washstand, even a tiny stove to ward off the mountain cold. "It's more than adequate," Eleanor said, genuinely impressed. Back in the main cabin, Caleb waited by the fire, his expression unreadable. "If I accept," Eleanor said carefully, "when would you expect me to begin?" "Tomorrow," he replied, "weather permitting." Eleanor glanced at Mabel, who nodded encouragingly. "I'll need to collect my things from Mrs. Holloway's. I'll return with you," Mabel offered. "Bring you back tomorrow if you decide. Decision time." Eleanor studied the silent mountain man before her. In town, she'd found nothing but rejection for her unusual height and circumstances. Here was meaningful work, fair compensation, and a man who looked her directly in the eye without flinching. "I accept your offer, Mr. Wolfe," she said, extending her hand. Caleb's large hand engulfed hers, his calloused palm warm against her skin. "Caleb," he corrected quietly. Their hands remained linked a moment longer than necessary, and Eleanor felt a curious sensation, as if some unspoken agreement had passed between them, something beyond employer and assistant. That evening, as Eleanor packed her meager belongings at the boarding house, Mrs. Holloway hovered anxiously. "It's not proper," she fretted, "a young woman alone with a man in the wilderness." "I'll have my own cabin," Eleanor assured her, "and Mr. Wolfe seems honorable." "Seems," Mrs. Holloway emphasized. "What do you really know about him?" "Very little," Eleanor acknowledged silently. Yet she'd recognized something in those ice-blue eyes, a kinship of sorts, between two people who didn't quite fit the world they inhabited. "I know enough," she said finally, "and I know what waits for me here. Nothing." The next morning dawned clear and bright, the sun turning the snow-covered landscape into a sea of diamonds. Mabel arrived with the wagon, as promised, and Mrs. Holloway fussed over Eleanor's departure with grudging concern, pressing a package of baked goods into her hands. As they left town, Eleanor glimpsed Thomas Whitley entering his mercantile. He paused when he spotted her in the wagon, his expression a mix of relief and lingering embarrassment. Eleanor nodded politely but felt no regret. His rejection had led her to this path, one that for the first time in years felt chosen rather than forced upon her. The journey seemed shorter in daylight, the wilderness less forbidding. Eleanor catalogued landmarks, determined to learn a route herself. When they crested the final rise, Caleb was waiting in the clearing, splitting wood with powerful, measured strokes. He set aside the axe as they approached, coming forward to help unload Eleanor's trunk. The morning sun caught in his dark hair, highlighting threads of silver at his temples. "Welcome," he said simply, carrying her trunk toward the small cabin with effortless strength. Eleanor turned to thank Mabel, only to find the older woman already climbing back into her wagon. "You'll be fine," Mabel said, answering Eleanor's unspoken question. "Caleb's bark is worse than his bite. What little barking he does." She winked. I'll check on you next week." Then Eleanor was alone with Caleb. Wolf, standing in the snow-filled clearing as Mabel's wagon disappeared down the trail. The silence enveloped them, broken only by the whisper of pine branches and the distant call of a bird. "Ready?" Caleb asked, gesturing toward the main cabin where work awaited. Eleanor nodded, straightening her spine. "Ready." Neither could have guessed how that single word would alter both their carefully constructed solitudes, binding them together in ways that would challenge everything they thought they knew about belonging. The first week passed in a rhythm of work and watchful silence. Eleanor arrived at the main cabin each morning as dawn broke, finding Caleb already at his desk or returning from early hunting. They would exchange brief nods before she immersed herself in organizing the chaos of his business affairs. The work itself proved surprisingly complex. Caleb's reputation extended far beyond what town gossip suggested. Orders came from as far as Denver and Seattle, not just for meat and furs, but for specific animals, particular cuts and premium pelts prepared in exact ways. His ledgers revealed a thriving enterprise that had grown almost despite his desire to remain isolated. Eleanor created systems where none existed, filing correspondence by region, organizing orders by priority, establishing delivery schedules that minimized Caleb's necessary interactions with outsiders. She discovered he had a flawless memory for details, but little patience for the mechanics of business. Their communication developed its own language. Caleb spoke rarely, but Eleanor quickly learned to read his expressions. The shift of his shoulders, the minute changes in his intense gaze. For a man of so few words, he conveyed volumes in gesture and glance. On the third day, she found a heavy wool coat draped over her chair when she arrived, expertly made, lined with soft rabbit fur, the sleeves and length perfectly suited to her tall frame. "I can't accept this," she said, running her fingers over the fine material. "It's too valuable." "Necessary," Caleb replied, not looking up from cleaning his rifle. "Winter's brutal here. Then I insist on paying." "Made it." He glanced up briefly. "No cost." The simple statement silenced her protests. Eleanor slipped the coat on, its weight settling around her like an embrace. For the first time since childhood, sleeves extended fully to her wrists, the hem reaching properly past her hips. "Thank you," she said quietly. "It fits perfectly." Caleb nodded once, returning to his work, but Eleanor caught the slight easing of tension around his eyes that she was learning to recognize as satisfaction. Meals were taken together at the heavy wooden table near the hearth. Caleb proved to be an unexpectedly competent cook, preparing simple but hearty food. Initially they ate in silence, but gradually Eleanor began filling the quiet with careful conversation, observations about orders, questions about procedures, occasionally stories from her life in Philadelphia. Caleb rarely responded verbally, but he listened with an intensity that made Eleanor feel truly heard for perhaps the first time in her life. There was something liberating about his silence. It demanded nothing, expected no particular response, allowed her thoughts to unfold naturally. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." On the 7th day, a Sunday, Eleanor woke to find heavy snow falling, blanketing the world in hushed white. As agreed, Sundays were hers to use as she wished. She spent the morning in her cabin, reading one of the books Caleb had wordlessly left on her doorstep the night before. Around midday, a knock drew her to the door. Caleb stood outside, snow dusting his broad shoulders, a steaming pot in his gloved hands. "Stew," he explained. "Weather's worsening." Eleanor stepped aside to let him enter. He placed the pot on her small stove, then hesitated, clearly uncomfortable in the confines of her space. "Would you join me?" she asked impulsively. "There's no sense in eating separately when we're both snowbound," Surprise flickered across his face, quickly masked. After a moment he nodded. They ate by the window, watching the snow transform the landscape. Warmed by food and the small stove's heat, Eleanor found herself relaxing into the silence they shared. "How long have you lived here?" she asked, curious about the man whose space she had occupied for a week, yet knew so little about. Caleb considered the question as he did all words, weighing them carefully before use. 8 years. Alone all that time? A nod. And before that? Something darkened in his eyes. War. The single word contained multitudes. Eleanor had seen returning soldiers in Philadelphia, men with missing limbs and haunted expressions, men who jumped at loud noises or stared unseeing at phantom horrors. "I lost my brother at Antietam," she offered quietly. James was 22. Caleb's eyes met hers, a flash of understanding passing between them. He didn't offer condolences or platitudes, just a simple nod acknowledging shared loss. Later, as he prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "Books," he said, gesturing vaguely toward her cabin's bare walls. "You'll need more." "I enjoy reading," Eleanor admitted. "In Philadelphia, I visited the library weekly." The next day, she arrived at the main cabin to find a small bookshelf installed. Near her desk, filled with volumes from Caleb's personal collection, history, natural science, poetry, and several well-worn novels. The gesture touched her more deeply than she could express. In Philadelphia, her height had marked her as an oddity, her intellect as a liability in securing a husband. Here, this silent man not only accepted her physical presence, but seemed to value her mind as well. As January deepened into February, the wilderness closed around them. Massive storms isolated the cabin for days at a time, but Eleanor found herself not minding the confinement. The work occupied her days, and increasingly, quiet evenings with Caleb filled the hours after dinner. They developed a routine. She would read aloud from one of his books while he worked on small carvings, his large hands surprisingly deft with the delicate knife. During one such evening, as wind howled outside and snow pattered against the windows, Eleanor looked up from her reading to find Caleb watching her, his expression unusually open. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. He seemed to debate whether to speak, then said simply, "Your voice. Is there something wrong with it?" He shook his head. "Pleasant. Reminds me, before." "Before the war?" Eleanor ventured, a slight nod. "Used to be." Words came easier. It was the longest personal statement he'd made, and Eleanor recognized the effort it cost him. "Does it trouble you, my talking?" "No." His response was immediate, emphatic. "Opposite. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Understanding dawned. "My voice helps with the silence." Caleb nodded, his eyes holding hers across the firelit room. "Then I shall continue reading," she said softly, "for both our sakes." The following week brought Mabel's promised visit, the older woman arriving bundled against the cold, her wagon loaded with supplies. Eleanor was surprised by how eagerly she greeted the familiar face, suddenly aware of how completely she had adapted to the isolated existence. "Well, you're still in one piece," Mabel observed approvingly, stomping snow from her boots as she entered the main cabin. "And looking healthier than when you left." It was true. Regular meals, mountain air, and purposeful work had brought color to Eleanor's cheeks and a strength to her tall frame that had been lacking before. Caleb acknowledged Mabel with a nod before disappearing outside to unload supplies, giving the women privacy. "So," Mabel prompted the moment he was gone, "how is it, really?" "Different than I expected," Eleanor admitted. "But good. The work suits me, and Mr. Wolfe, Caleb, is a fair employer." Mabel's shrewd eyes studied her. Just an employer, is he? Eleanor felt warmth rising in her cheeks. What else would he be? Honey, I've known Caleb Wolf 8 years. Never once has he sought companionship, female or otherwise. Now suddenly he needs an assistant who happens to be the only woman in 3 territories who can meet his eyes without craning her neck. He values competence, Eleanor protested, and the business genuinely needed organizing. Mabel raised an eyebrow. Town's buzzing with talk about it. Thomas Whitley's been particularly vocal, claims he dodged a bullet with you, though everyone knows he's just sore that Caleb's trade has grown while his mercantile struggles. What do you mean? Seems many customers prefer ordering through, say the service is more reliable, pricing more fair, letters get answered, orders filled correctly. She winked. Quite the improvement. Eleanor hadn't realized her work was having such an impact. She'd simply applied the same diligence. That had earned her grudging respect at the millinery. Speaking of town, Mabel continued, lowering her voice, there's talk of a spring social in April, first big gathering since Harvest Festival. You might consider attending, show folks you're thriving despite Thomas's rejection. The idea held a certain appeal. Perhaps, Eleanor said non-committally. When Caleb returned, Mabel engaged him in one of the most one-sided conversations Eleanor had ever witnessed, updating him on town news while he responded with occasional nods or single word. Acknowledgements. Before departing, Mabel pressed a package into Eleanor's hands. New fabric, she explained, for a proper dress. That navy wool has seen better days, and a woman should have something pretty, even in the wilderness. After Mabel left, the cabin seemed unusually quiet. Eleanor returned to her desk, but found her thoughts drifting to the town social, to the possibility of emerging from isolation to show a different face to those who had dismissed her. You should go, Caleb's voice startled her. He stood by the hearth, watching her with that direct gaze. To town, April. You heard that? A slight smile curved beneath his beard. Hear everything. Would you attend as well? Eleanor asked, trying to imagine this imposing silent man among the townspeople's festivities. His expression shuddered. No? Because you dislike town or because you dislike socializing? Both. He hesitated, then added quietly, people see this. He gestured to the scar bisecting his face, to his imposing size. Nothing else. The raw honesty in his words struck Eleanor deeply. How well she understood being reduced to a physical characteristic, being seen as nothing beyond an unusual height, a face too strong-featured for fashionable beauty. I see more, she said simply. Something shifted in Caleb's eyes, vulnerability quickly masked, but not before Eleanor caught its fleeting presence. He nodded once, then turned away, but the atmosphere between them had altered subtly, irrevocably, as February surrendered to March. The first tentative signs of spring appeared. Longer days, occasional bird calls, patches of ground emerging from beneath melting snow. The isolation of deep winter eased, allowing Caleb to resume more regular hunting trips and deliveries to nearby trading posts. During his absences, which sometimes stretched to 2 or 3 days, Eleanor found herself listening for his return, with an anticipation that went beyond professional concern. The cabin felt different without his quiet presence, larger yet somehow emptier. On a particularly mild afternoon, she ventured further from the cabins than she had previously dared, following a narrow trail that wound behind the main structure. It led to a small, sheltered hollow where snowdrops pushed through the last patches of snow. Beyond stood a simple wooden marker, weathered but well-maintained. Eleanor approached slowly, recognition dawning as she made out the name carved into the wood. Sarah Wolf, beloved wife, 1844-1865. A wife. The revelation struck her with unexpected force. Nothing in the cabin had suggested Caleb had shared his life here, Yet this carefully tended grave spoke of deep attachment. Illness, Caleb's voice came from behind her. First winter here. Eleanor turned to find him watching her, his expression unreadable. She hadn't heard him return from his latest hunting trip. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to intrude." Not intruding. He moved to stand beside her, his gaze on the simple marker. "She would have liked you." "Tell me about her," Eleanor asked gently. Caleb was silent so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, haltingly at first, then with growing certainty, he began to speak, more words than Eleanor had heard from him in the 2 months of their acquaintance. "Sarah was light, laughter, city-born like you, followed me west after the war, believed in beginnings." His voice softened. "Too delicate for mountain winters. Fever took her our first December. And you stayed. Her dream." He gestured. "Toward the cabin, the clearing. Our dream. Couldn't leave." The simple explanation contained worlds of loyalty, of love preserved beyond death. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, not for the woman she had never known, but for the man who had carved his grief into a life of solitude. "Thank you for telling me," she said. Caleb nodded, his eyes meeting hers with the direct gaze that had first struck her in the mercantile. "First time, speaking of her, since." The significance of his words settled between them like a physical presence. This taciturn man, who measured words as precisely as he measured powder for his rifle, had chosen to share his deepest loss with her. As they walked back to the cabin together, something had changed. A barrier crossed, a distance narrowed. Eleanor found herself acutely aware of his presence beside her, of the way his steps unconsciously shortened to match her pace, of how his hand briefly steadied her when she stumbled on the uneven ground. That evening, as they shared a quiet meal, Caleb surprised her by initiating conversation. "The social," he said, "in town, you should attend." Eleanor looked up from her plate. "Would my absence for a day disrupt your business?" "No." He hesitated, then added, "People should see you as you are." "And how is that?" she asked, genuinely curious about how this observant, silent man perceived her. His eyes held hers across the table. Strong, capable, beautiful. The last word hung in the air between them, as startling as a gunshot in the quiet cabin. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, her heart suddenly pounding against her ribs. Thank you," she managed. Caleb nodded once, returning his attention to his meal, but the word remained, wrapping around Eleanor like the fur-lined coat he had made for her, unexpected, perfectly fitted, warming her through. April arrived with the sudden decisiveness of mountain seasons. 1 week brought lingering snow flurries, the next, wildflowers erupted along the forest edges. The social Mabel had mentioned loomed closer, and with it, an unexpected tension in the cabin. "I've been invited to stay with Mrs. Holloway for the weekend of the social," Eleanor mentioned one evening as she tallied the month's accounts. Mabel delivered the invitation with yesterday's supplies. Caleb looked up from his workbench, where he was repairing a trap, his hands momentarily stilling. "Good," he said, though something in his tone suggested otherwise. Eleanor studied him, across the room. 3 months in his company had taught her to read volumes in his smallest gestures, the slight tightening of his shoulders, the way his fingers gripped the tools with unnecessary force. "It's only for 2 nights," she added. "I'll return Sunday afternoon." Caleb nodded, returning to his work with deliberate focus. "Town will welcome you now." The statement caught her off guard. "What do you mean?" He met her eyes briefly. "Success changes how people see you. Your work here, respected now." A complicated emotion washed through Eleanor. When she'd first arrived, in Whitefish, doors had closed in her face, eyes had skimmed past her unusual height with discomfort or dismissal. Now, apparently, the town viewed her differently, not because she had changed, but because her association with Caleb's thriving. Business lent her value. "I haven't forgotten their reception," she said quietly. Caleb's hands paused again. People fear difference until they need it. The insight struck Eleanor as profoundly true, both of herself and of the man before her. They had each been set apart, she by her height, he by the war that had stolen his words and left that jagged scar, yet found unexpected connection in their shared isolation. 3 days before the social, a letter arrived with Mabel's regular delivery. Eleanor recognized Thomas Whitley's handwriting immediately and felt a flicker of irritation. Since her departure from town, several orders had come from his mercantile, terse, businesslike requests that carefully avoided any acknowledgement of their previous acquaintance. She broke the seal, scanning the contents with growing disbelief. "Something wrong?" Caleb asked, noting her expression. "It seems Mr. Whitley wishes to renew our acquaintance at the social," Eleanor replied, unable to keep the edge from her voice. "He suggests that perhaps he was hasty in his initial assessment and hopes I will favor him with a dance." Caleb's face remained impassive, but his eyes hardened. "Man's a fool twice over. Apparently my association with your business has made me acceptable," Eleanor said, the letter trembling slightly in her hand, "though I remain exactly as tall as I was 3 months ago. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." "What will you do?" Caleb asked after a moment. Eleanor folded the letter deliberately and set it aside. "Attend the social, dance if asked, though not with Thomas Whitley. Show the town that I am thriving, not desperate for their approval." Caleb nodded, satisfaction evident in the slight easing of his posture. "Good." That evening, as they shared the comfortable silence that had become their habit, Eleanor found herself unexpectedly reluctant to leave for town, even temporarily. This cabin in the wilderness, this quiet man with his careful words, had become more home to her than anywhere she'd known before. "Caleb," she said softly. He looked up from the book he'd been reading, one of the few activities where he seemed truly at peace. "Thank you for everything." His expression softened in the way she'd come to treasure, not quite a smile, but a gentling of his features that transformed him. "No need." "There is," she insisted. "You offered me work when no one else would. You've never once made me feel too much." Caleb closed his book, his intense gaze holding hers. "You're not too much," he said with quiet certainty. "Never were." The simple statement, delivered with such conviction, touched something deep within Eleanor. All her life she had been made to feel excessive, too tall, too plain, too bookish, too independent. Here was a man who saw her completely and found nothing lacking, nothing overwhelming. "Come with me," she said impulsively, "to the social." Tension immediately returned to his frame. Can't or won't." His jaw tightened beneath his beard. "Both." Eleanor moved to sit beside him, close enough to sense the warmth radiating from his large frame. "Is it the crowds? The noise?" Caleb's eyes fixed on the fire, its light revealing the texture of his scar. "People see this," he gestured to his face, to his imposing size. "See a damaged man who doesn't." "Speak easily," Eleanor finished gently. "I know, but you've spoken more in the past month than in the previous 3, haven't you?" A reluctant nod. "With me. With you," he agreed quietly. "Because I listen differently. Because you're worth the effort." The words emerged with difficulty, pulled from some deep reserve of determination. Eleanor's breath caught. In that moment, she wanted nothing more than to reach for his hand, to bridge the careful distance they had maintained. But something held her back, Uncertainty, perhaps, or the fear of disrupting the delicate balance they had achieved. The next day, as Eleanor packed a small bag for her journey to town, she found herself lingering over which dress to bring. The navy wool that had been her standby seemed suddenly inadequate. Mabel had brought fabric weeks ago, but Eleanor hadn't found time to fashion it into anything new. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. A knock at her cabin door interrupted her deliberations. Caleb stood outside, holding a wrapped package. "For you," he said, extending it toward her. "For the social." Eleanor unwrapped the paper to reveal a dress of deep forest green, the fabric finer than anything she'd owned before. Its lines were simple but elegant, with none of the excessive ruffles or bustles that made most ready-made dresses impossible for her frame. "It's beautiful," she whispered, holding it against herself. "But how—" "Sarah taught me," Caleb explained, his voice soft with memory. "Before, she was small, needed alterations." A slight gesture toward Eleanor. "Measured from your coat." Eleanor ran her fingers over the precise stitching, the carefully finished seams. This dress had been made by those large, calloused hands. The same hands that cleaned rifles, skinned game, and carved delicate figures by firelight, made specifically for her unusual height, with sleeves that would reach her wrists and a hem that would fall properly to her ankles. "Thank you seems inadequate," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Caleb shook his head, dismissing her gratitude. "You'll stand tall in town, as you should." The double meaning wasn't lost on Eleanor. All her life she had hunched, apologized for her height, tried to make herself smaller to accommodate others' discomfort. Now this man was telling her, in his way, to claim her full stature, both physical and otherwise. The morning of her departure arrived with perfect spring weather. Eleanor emerged from her cabin in the green dress, her dark hair arranged simply but elegantly. She had expected to ride to town alone, following the trail she now knew well, but found Caleb waiting with 2 saddled horses. "You'll escort me?" she asked, surprised. "To the edge of town," he clarified. "Safer." They rode in companionable silence, the forest awakening around them. Eleanor found herself memorizing details, the way sunlight filtered through new leaves, the rhythm of hoofbeats on the softening trail, the solid presence of the man riding beside her. As they approached the outskirts of Whitefish, Caleb reined his horse to a stop. Eleanor halted beside him, suddenly reluctant to continue forward into the town that had once rejected her. "Sunday," he said, his eyes holding hers. "I'll wait here, noon." "I'll be here," she promised. For a moment, something unspoken hung in the air between them. Then Caleb reached across the space separating their horses, his hand briefly covering hers where it rested on the reins. The touch was fleeting but deliberate, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. Without another word, he turned his horse and rode back toward the mountains, leaving Eleanor to continue alone into Whitefish. The town appeared both familiar and strange after months away. Eleanor rode directly to Mrs. Holloway's boarding house, where the older woman greeted her with genuine pleasure. "Look at you," Mrs. Holloway exclaimed, circling Eleanor with approving eyes. "The mountain air agrees with you, dear. And that dress, why, it fits you perfectly." "Caleb made it," Eleanor said, unable to keep a note of pride from her voice. Mrs. Holloway's eyebrows rose dramatically. "The mountain man sews? He has many skills people don't know about." "I'll say," Mrs. Holloway murmured, helping Eleanor with her bag. "The whole town's been talking about your arrangement. Quite the scandal at first, though folks have quieted down since the business has been running so smoothly." "There's nothing scandalous about honest employment," Eleanor replied firmly. "Of course not, dear. Now come in and rest. You'll want to be fresh for tonight's social." The town hall had been transformed with spring garlands and lanterns, a small band set up at one end. Eleanor entered alone, her heart beating rapidly beneath the green dress. Conversations paused as people noticed her arrival, eyes widening. At her transformed appearance, Mabel was the first to approach, embracing Eleanor warmly. "You look magnificent," she whispered. Half the room just swallowed their tongues. Eleanor laughed, some of her tension easing. "Good. Let them choke her." Bit. Thomas Whitley approached next, his expression an uncomfortable mixture of admiration and chagrin. "Miss Blackwood," he began, his eyes taking in her appearance. "You're looking well." "Thank you, Mr. Whitley," Eleanor replied coolly. "Your recent orders have been fulfilled exactly as specified. Was there a business matter you wished to discuss?" His face flushed. "I had hoped we might. That is, I wonder if you would consider a dance." "I'm afraid I've promised my dances elsewhere." "This evening," she said, though no such promises existed. "If you'll excuse me." As she moved away, Eleanor caught Mabel's approving grin. For the first time in her life, she had rejected rather than being rejected, and the sensation was surprisingly sweet. The evening progressed better than Eleanor had anticipated. Several men asked her to dance, treating her with a respect that would have been unimaginable 3 months earlier. She spoke with Mrs. Holloway's new boarders, caught up with townspeople who now regarded her with curiosity rather than dismissal, and even shared a dance with the mayor, who inquired specifically about Caleb's business practices. "Your employer has developed quite a reputation for fair dealing," the mayor commented, as they circled the floor. "Quite a change from his earlier years when he barely spoke to anyone." "Mr. Wolfe values honesty and directness," Eleanor replied. "His customers appreciate knowing exactly where they stand." "Indeed," the mayor studied her thoughtfully, "and you've become quite the ambassador for his enterprise. Remarkable transformation for a woman who arrived with such limited prospects." The condescension in his tone sparked Eleanor's temper. "I arrived with the same skills and character I possess now, Mayor Brooks. The only transformation has been in how those qualities are perceived." Later, as Eleanor helped Mabel serve refreshments, she overheard 2 women whispering nearby. "They say she lives in a separate cabin, but who knows what really happens up there in those mountains." "Well, I heard Thomas Whitley is determined to bring her back to town, thinks she'd be an asset to his business now that she's proven herself." As if she'd trade the mountain man for him. "Did you see the way she dismissed him earlier?" Thomas must be regretting his hasty judgment now. Eleanor moved away, unsettled by their gossip. The social she had anticipated with such mixed emotions had revealed something unexpected. She no longer cared for this town's approval. Their acceptance came too late and with too many conditions. What she valued now was the honest connection she had found in a quiet cabin with a man of few words and profound understanding. That night, in Mrs. Holloway's spare room, Eleanor found sleep elusive. She thought of Caleb alone in his cabin, wondered if he too lay awake, missing their shared silences. Tomorrow she would return to the mountains, to work that fulfilled her, to a man who saw her true measure. The realization struck her with sudden clarity. She was falling in love with Caleb Wolfe. The thought should have frightened her, but instead brought a sense of rightness, of pieces finally settling into their proper places. Sunday morning dawned bright and clear. Eleanor prepared to leave with barely concealed eagerness, thanking Mrs. Holloway for her hospitality while deflecting questions about when she might return to town. As she mounted her borrowed horse, a familiar figure approached. Thomas Whitley, looking uncharacteristically disheveled. "Miss Blackwood," he called, hurrying toward her. "A moment, please." Eleanor reluctantly reined her horse to a stop. "Yes, Mr. Whitley?" "I've been considering," he said, slightly breathless. how valuable your organizational skills would be to my mercantile. I'm prepared to offer you a position, assistant, manager, with living quarters above the shop and a salary comparable to what Wolf pays." Eleanor stared at him, momentarily speechless. "You rejected me as a wife because I was too tall, and now you offer me employment for the same skills I possessed." "Then I was hasty," Thomas admitted, coloring slightly. "But surely you can understand my position. A business arrangement is different from other considerations." "Is it?" Eleanor asked coldly. "Or have you simply reassessed my value now that someone else recognizes it?" Thomas straightened, affronted. "Life in town would offer comforts and society that Wolf's isolated cabin cannot. You'd be among civilized people again." "The most civilized person I know lives in those mountains, Mr. Whitley," Eleanor replied, gathering her reins. "Good day." She rode out of town with her back straight and her head high, never once looking back. The weight that had pressed on her since arriving in Whitefish lifted with each hoofbeat, carrying her toward the wilderness, toward home. As promised, Caleb waited at the edge of town. He sat motionless on his horse, a sentinel carved from stone, watching the trail with unwavering concentration. When Eleanor appeared, something in his posture eased, a tension released so subtle that only someone who knew him well would notice. "You came back," he said as she reached him, the simple statement carrying layers of meaning. "Of course," Eleanor replied, smiling. "I said I would." They rode side by side toward the mountains, the familiar trail now vibrant with spring growth. Eleanor found herself describing the social in detail, the decorations, the music, the conversations that had revealed how differently the town now viewed her. "Thomas Whitley offered me a position at his mercantile," she added, watching Caleb from the corner of her eye. "Assistant manager with living quarters and comparable pay." Caleb's hands tightened on his reins, the only outward sign of his reaction. "You refused." It wasn't a question, but Eleanor answered anyway. "I did," rather emphatically. They rode, in silence for several minutes, the sounds of the forest surrounding them, birdsong, wind through new leaves, the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. "You could have a life there," Caleb said finally, his voice low. "Among people." "I have a life," Eleanor replied simply. "One I've chosen." As they crested the final ridge before the clearing, the cabin came into view below, solid, welcoming, smoke curling from its chimney. Eleanor felt a surge of emotion at the sight. This place that had initially represented her last desperate chance had become something else entirely, something precious. "Home," she said softly. Caleb's gaze shifted to her face, his expression unreadable. "Yes." That evening, as they shared a meal of fresh trout and early spring greens, Eleanor sensed a change in Caleb, a restlessness, a struggle with words even more pronounced than usual. She waited patiently, knowing he would speak when ready in his own way. Finally, as she rose to clear their plates, his hand caught hers. "Eleanor." Her name, in his deep voice, stopped her instantly. He rarely used it, preferring gestures and glances. "To direct address, yes?" she asked, suddenly breathless. "If you stay—" He began, then paused, frustration flickering across his face as words failed him. "I'm not leaving," she assured him gently. He shook his head, still holding her hand. "Not as assistant, not for work." Eleanor's heart began beating faster. "Then as what? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Caleb stood, towering over her despite her own considerable height. "As partner, as—" He swallowed hard, his free hand clenching at his side as he fought for the word. "Wife." The directness of it, so characteristic of him, took her breath away. No flowery proposal, no careful courtship, just the truth of what he wanted, offered without artifice. "You want to marry me?" Eleanor asked, needing the clarity of plain speech between them. Caleb nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "Yes." "Why?" The question wasn't rejection, merely a desire to understand this taciturn man whose every word came at a cost. He released her hand, stepping back slightly as he gathered his thoughts. When he spoke again, the words came slowly, but with determination. "You build the empty spaces, not just cabin here." He pressed a hand to his chest. "Thought those spaces dead, like words. You brought them back." Tears sprang to Eleanor's eyes at the raw honesty of his declaration. Never in her life had anyone valued her so completely, seen past her physical appearance to the person beneath. "I have nothing to offer but this," Caleb continued, gesturing to the cabin, the clearing. "Simple life. Hard sometimes, but honest." "It's everything I want," Eleanor whispered, moving toward him. "You're everything I want." His large hands came up to frame her face with exquisite gentleness, his calloused thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "Certain, absolutely certain," she replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Caleb's kiss was tentative at first, as if he feared she might vanish beneath his touch. Then, as she responded, it deepened into something profound. A communication more eloquent than any words could have been. When they finally parted, breathless, the look in his eyes kindled something warm and fierce in Eleanor's chest. For the first time in her life, she felt truly seen, truly valued, not despite her differences, but because of them. "When?" she asked, "practical even in this transformative moment?" "Soon," Caleb replied. "Summer, after trading season." Eleanor nodded, understanding the rhythm of mountain life that dictated their plans. Spring and early summer brought Caleb's busiest trading period, with new pelts and game to prepare and deliver. "I should return to my cabin," she said reluctantly, aware of propriety even in their isolation. Caleb nodded, releasing her with visible effort. "For now." The following weeks passed in a blur of activity and quiet joy. Eleanor continued managing the business side of Caleb's trading, but now their shared meals lingered longer. Their evenings by the fire included moments of tentative touch, her hand in his arm around her shoulders, the occasional sweet kiss that left them both shaken. With its promise, word of their engagement spread quickly, carried by Mabel during her supply runs. The reaction from town was predictably mixed. Some approved of the match between two outsiders, while others whispered about the strangeness of it. The tall woman and the scarred mountain man finding in each other what conventional society had denied them. Eleanor found she didn't care. The life she was building with Caleb had a solidness to it, a truth that made town gossip seem petty and irrelevant. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As June approached, bringing wildflowers and lengthening days, a letter arrived that disrupted their careful happiness. Eleanor recognized her mother's handwriting immediately, though she hadn't received correspondence from Philadelphia in over 6 months. "Bad news?" Caleb asked, noting her expression as she read. "My mother is coming to Montana," Eleanor replied, disbelief coloring her voice. "Apparently Mrs. Holloway wrote to her about our engagement." Caleb went very still. "When?" "The letter's dated weeks ago. She could arrive any day." Eleanor looked up from the paper, anxiety tightening her chest. "I should warn you, my mother. It'd be challenging." That was a generous description of Margaret Blackwood, a woman whose disappointment in her too tall, unmarriageable daughter had been a constant undercurrent in Eleanor's life. After Eleanor's father died, that disappointment had calcified into resentful dependence, making Eleanor's escape to Montana both necessary and guilt-laden. "She won't approve," Eleanor continued, folding the letter carefully, "of anything. Me, working, living in the wilderness, certainly not marrying someone like me," Caleb finished quietly. Eleanor moved to stand before him, taking his large hands in hers. "Her approval doesn't matter to me. I just want you to be prepared for her." "Difficulties?" Caleb nodded, but a new tension had entered his frame. Eleanor realized with sudden clarity that this man who faced mountain winters and dangerous predators without flinching was genuinely anxious about meeting her mother. "She'll only stay briefly," Eleanor assured him. "There's nowhere for her in town, and she's never been comfortable with anything beyond city conveniences." Caleb squeezed her hands gently. "We'll manage." 3 days later, Mabel's wagon appeared on the trail, accompanied by another carrying a pile of trunks and a diminutive woman in an impractical traveling suit. Eleanor, who had been watching anxiously from the cabin window, straightened her dress and went outside to greet them. "Mother," she called, forcing brightness into her voice, "welcome to Montana." Margaret Blackwood stepped down from the wagon with the driver's assistance, her disapproving gaze sweeping over the clearing, the cabins, and finally, her daughter. "Eleanor," she acknowledged stiffly, "I see you're still flaunting your unfortunate height. I had hoped frontier life might have taught you to carry yourself more modestly." Eleanor felt her shoulders begin to curve inward from old habit, then stopped herself, remembering Caleb's words about standing tall. "How was your journey, Mother?" "Interminable," Margaret sniffed. "The accommodations were primitive, the food inedible, and the company coarse. I cannot imagine what possessed you to travel so far from civilization." "Necessity," Eleanor replied simply, "and now choice." Margaret's attention shifted suddenly, her eyes widening. Eleanor turned to find Caleb standing in the doorway of the main cabin, his imposing figure filling the frame. "Mother, this is Caleb." "A wolf," Eleanor said, moving to stand beside him, unconsciously aligning herself with his quiet strength. "My fiancé." Margaret's expression cycled rapidly through shock, horror, and calculation. "Mr. Wolf," she said finally, her voice brittle, "I understand you've been employing my daughter." Caleb nodded, stepping forward to assist with Margaret's luggage. "Ma'am, he speaks!" Margaret exclaimed with false brightness. "Mrs. Holloway's letter mentioned you were practically mute, Mr. Wolf. A war injury, I understand." Eleanor felt. Caleb tense beside her. "Mother, you must be tired after your journey. I've prepared the small cabin for you. It has its own stove and washstand." "I'm expected to stay in that?" Margaret gestured dismissively toward Eleanor's cabin. "Where will you sleep then?" "I'll remain there as well until the wedding," Eleanor replied firmly. "Caleb will stay in the main cabin as always." Margaret's lips pursed in disapproval, but she allowed herself to be escorted to the smaller cabin. Once inside, she turned a calculating eye on her daughter. "This is madness, Eleanor," she hissed, once they were alone. "Living in the wilderness with a man who can barely speak, who looks like that." She gestured vaguely toward her own face, indicating Caleb's scar. "I love him," Eleanor said quietly, "and he loves me exactly as I am." "Love," Margaret scoffed. "What has love ever brought any woman but trouble? You had a chance for respectability as a mail-order bride, and instead you've attached yourself to a mountain savage." Eleanor felt a surge of protective anger. "Caleb is the most honorable, gentle man I've ever known. His cabin contains more books than most Philadelphia parlors. He reads Greek, speaks 3 languages, when he chooses to speak, and has built a thriving business through integrity and hard work." "Then why doesn't the town sing his praises?" Margaret demanded. Mrs. Holloway's letter made quite clear that he's considered an oddity at best, frightening at worst. Because people fear what they don't understand, Eleanor replied, echoing Mabel's words from months ago. And Caleb doesn't care enough about their opinions to correct them. Margaret subsided temporarily, turning her attention to unpacking the smallest of her trunks. Well, I'm here now, and I intend to see this situation clearly. Perhaps there's still time to extract you from this arrangement. That evening, the three shared an uncomfortable dinner in the main cabin. Eleanor had prepared a simple but elegant meal, hoping to impress her mother with her domestic capabilities. Margaret picked at the food, her gaze constantly darting around the cabin, noting the books, the quality furnishings, the careful order that defied her expectations of frontier living. "Your home is surprisingly civilized, Mr. Wolfe," she finally commented. "One might almost forget one was in the wilderness." Caleb inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement. "Do you never speak?" Margaret pressed, her tone deceptively light. "Or is my daughter's chatter enough for both of you?" "Mother," Eleanor warned. "When necessary," Caleb replied, his deep voice startling in the tense atmosphere. "I see." Margaret set down her fork. "And is it necessary to explain why you believe yourself worthy of my daughter?" Eleanor felt hot embarrassment flood her face. "Mother, that's enough." But Caleb placed a gentle hand on her arm, silencing her protest. He met Margaret's challenging gaze directly, his expression calm but determined. "Not worthy," he said quietly. "Fortunate." The simple statement hung in the air, its honesty disarming even Margaret's prepared criticisms. She blinked, momentarily thrown off her practiced script of maternal concern. "Eleanor deserves everything," Caleb continued, each word deliberate. "Trying to be that every day." Margaret's mouth opened and closed without sound, her careful edifice of disapproval cracking slightly in the face of his sincerity. "Well," she managed finally, "at least you recognize her value, which is more than can be said for that shopkeeper who rejected her." In the days that followed, Margaret observed the rhythms of their life with sharp eyes. She watched Eleanor manage correspondence, direct shipments, and negotiate with traders who visited the cabin. She saw how Caleb deferred to Eleanor's judgment in business matters while protecting her with quiet vigilance from the physical dangers of mountain life. Most tellingly, she witnessed their unspoken communication, how Eleanor anticipated Caleb's needs before he expressed them, how he adjusted his pace to match hers when they walked together, how their eyes found each other across the cabin in moments of shared understanding. A week into her visit, Margaret cornered Eleanor while Caleb was hunting. "I still think this life is madness," she declared without preamble, "but I can see he values you properly, which is rare enough." Coming from Margaret, this was tantamount to enthusiastic blessing. Eleanor felt a weight lift from her shoulders. "Thank you, Mother." "Don't thank me yet," Margaret sniffed. "I still intend to stay until this wedding occurs. Someone must ensure it's done properly." Eleanor suppressed a smile. "Of course." That evening, as Margaret retired early, claiming exhaustion from rustic living, Eleanor found Caleb sitting outside on the bench he'd carved from a massive pine stump. She settled beside him, her shoulder against his arm, both of them gazing at the stars emerging in the darkening sky. "She's staying until the wedding," Eleanor told him. Caleb absorbed this information with typical stoicism. "Can bear it, for you." Eleanor laughed softly. "For us, she's adjusting in her way." His arm slipped around her waist, drawing her closer. "Courage runs in family." "Not courage," Eleanor corrected, resting her head against his shoulder. "Just the stubbornness to stand tall when the world tells you to shrink." Caleb's fingers trailed along her arm, leaving warmth in their wake. "Perfect height," he murmured against her hair. In that moment, under a canopy of Montana stars, with this quiet man's arms around her, Eleanor knew, with unshakable certainty, that she had found her place. Not despite being too tall, but precisely because she had finally grown into the full measure of herself. Outside, the clearing had been transformed. Wooden benches lined a path strewn with pine needles and summer blossoms. The arch, now richly decorated with evergreens and wild roses, stood at the far end where Caleb waited with the circuit preacher, who had ridden in from Helena. The small crowd, larger than Eleanor had expected, included Mabel and her family, Mrs. Holloway, the new school teacher, several traders Caleb had worked with over the years, and even Thomas Whitley, whose expression showed complicated emotions as she appeared at the path's entrance on her mother's arm. But Eleanor saw none of them. Her eyes found Caleb immediately, standing tall and straight in new clothes, his dark hair pulled back neatly, his beard trimmed. As she walked toward him, his expression transformed, the careful reserve falling away to reveal naked wonder. When she reached him, he took her hands in his, their unusual heights matching perfectly. The preacher began speaking, but the words seemed distant compared to the silent communication flowing between them, a lifetime of promises exchanged in glances. When asked for his vows, Caleb surprised everyone, including Eleanor. The words came not in his usual measured phrases, but in a steady flow, as if he had rehearsed them countless times in the privacy of his thoughts. Eleanor, you came to these mountains a stranger, but recognized what was true here when others saw only wilderness. You stood tall when the world wanted you smaller. You brought order to chaos, voice to silence, and light to places long dark. I offer you my protection, though you need it least of anyone I know, my words, though they come hard, and my heart which has been yours since you first met my eyes without flinching. This I promise, from this day until my last. Tears blurred Eleanor's vision as she spoke her own vows, simpler but no less heartfelt. Then Caleb was sliding a ring onto her finger, a band of gold he had commissioned from a craftsman in Helena, carved with tiny mountain peaks that matched the view from their cabin. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the preacher declared, his voice carrying across the hushed clearing. Caleb's kiss was gentle but certain, a public declaration of private devotion. When they turned to face their guests, Eleanor caught her mother dabbing surreptitiously at her eyes. The celebration continued into evening, lanterns illuminating the clearing as food was shared, music played, and stories told. Eleanor found unexpected joy in watching Caleb navigate the social gathering, still quiet, still reserved, but no longer completely silent. With her at his side, he spoke when necessary, even managing brief conversations with guests brave enough to approach him. As twilight deepened toward night, Eleanor found herself beside her mother, both watching as Caleb showed Mabel's youngest son how to properly split kindling for the fire. He's not what I wanted for you, Margaret admitted quietly, but perhaps he's what you needed all along. He is, Eleanor agreed simply, and this place. Margaret gestured to the cabin, the mountains, beyond. This isolation, you truly prefer it to civilization? Eleanor considered the question seriously. It's not isolation when you're with the right person. Here, I'm valued for exactly who I am. The world tried to make me smaller, Mother. Caleb helped me stand at my full height. Margaret studied her daughter's face, noting the confidence, the contentment that had been absent in Philadelphia. Then I suppose I must concede that you've chosen correctly against all odds and my better judgment. The highest praise I could hope for, Eleanor laughed, impulsively embracing her mother. Later, as the guests departed, Eleanor and Caleb stood together at the edge of the clearing, watching lanterns and torches wind down the trail toward town. Margaret had been persuaded to return with Mrs. Holloway, giving the newlyweds privacy for their first night as husband and wife. Glad they're gone? Eleanor asked, leaning against Caleb's solid warmth. Yes, he admitted without apology, his arm tightening around her waist. "Prefer just us. We have a lifetime of just us ahead," she promised, turning in his embrace to face him. Above them, stars emerged in the darkening sky, more brilliant than any city dweller could imagine. The mountains stood sentinel around them, ancient and enduring, and in Caleb's eyes, Eleanor saw her own reflection, not the too tall, unmarriageable woman she had once believed herself to be, but someone worthy, valuable, and perfectly suited to the life she had chosen. "Home," Caleb said softly, the single word containing everything. "Home," Eleanor agreed, rising on tiptoe to kiss her husband as night settled around their cabin in the wilderness. "Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us." "Money would secure our future," he said carefully. "No more lean winters, no more uncertainty." Margaret nodded enthusiastically. "Precisely. A man in your position must consider his wife's comfort." "But Eleanor began, unable to imagine. Caleb confined to a city, separated from the mountains that had healed him. "Would be difficult," he acknowledged, meeting her eyes. "For me, but for you. Better society, proper home, the life you deserve." Eleanor felt a chill, despite the summer warmth. "Is that what you think I want?" Before he could answer, Margaret interjected, "Of course it's what any sensible woman wants. Security, society, respectability, everything you came west seeking in the first place." "No," Eleanor said with sudden clarity. "That's what you wanted for me, Mother. What I sought was escape from a world that had no place for someone like me. What I found was a man who values me exactly as I am, and a life with true purpose." She moved to stand before Caleb, taking his hands in hers. "I don't want Helena. I don't want civilization or society's approval. I want our life, here, together." The relief that flooded his face was painful to witness. "Certain?" he asked softly. "More certain than I've ever been about anything," she assured him. Margaret watched this exchange with growing frustration. "You can't possibly mean to reject such an opportunity. Think of what it would mean for your children, for your future." "Our children will learn far more valuable lessons here than in any city," Eleanor replied calmly. "Honesty, simplicity, the value of work done well, the courage to stand apart when necessary." She turned back to Caleb. "But the decision must be yours as well. If you believe the railroad contract would benefit us, I'll support you." Caleb's eyes, usually so carefully guarded, showed his internal conflict. For several moments, he was silent, weighing options, considering futures. Finally he spoke, each word deliberate. "Built this place after Sarah died. Thought it would be just me. Always." His eyes held Eleanor's. "Then you came, made it more. Made it home." He glanced toward the window, toward the mountains, beyond. "This land speaks. Cities too loud to hear it, too crowded to breathe." Eleanor smiled, understanding completely. "Then we stay." "And the contract?" Margaret demanded incredulously. "All that money?" Caleb considered this practical concern. "Seriously, could supply from here," he said thoughtfully. "Hire help, expand, but remain ourselves." Eleanor's mind raced with possibilities. "We could build another cabin for workers, establish regular delivery schedules. Mabel's son Jim is looking for steady work, and there are others in town with hunting skills." The shadow of a smile crossed Caleb's face. "Always solving problems. It's what I do best," she replied, squeezing his hands. The next morning, Eleanor rode into Whitefish with Caleb, their counter-proposal carefully drafted after hours of discussion. They would supply the railroad at a slightly higher price than originally offered, reflecting the additional transportation costs. but would remain on their mountain property, hiring local men as needed to meet the increased demand. Blackwood was initially skeptical, but ultimately pragmatic. The Northern Pacific needed reliable meat supplies more than it needed to dictate a supplier's living arrangements. Very well, he conceded after reviewing their terms. Though I must say, Mrs. Wolfterby, you drive a hard bargain. Miss Blackwood drives the only bargain that matters, Thomas Whitley interjected unexpectedly. One that preserves what's truly invaluable. Eleanor glanced at him in surprise, noting a new respect in his expression. Perhaps rejection had taught him something after all. As they rode back toward the mountains, contract secured on their terms, Eleanor felt a profound sense of rightness settle over her. That wasn't so difficult, she observed. All those words, and you managed them beautifully. Caleb gave her a sidelong glance, a rare smile lightening his features. Had proper motivation. The contract. You, he corrected simply. Always you. When they reached the clearing, they found Margaret supervising the construction of an archway at the exact spot she had designated for the ceremony. The older woman's face showed conflicting emotions as they dismounted. You've made your decision. Then, she said, not quite a question. We have, Eleanor confirmed. We're staying here but accepting a modified contract that will secure our future. Margaret sighed dramatically. I suppose I should have expected as much. You've always been stubborn beyond reason, Eleanor. I prefer to think of it as knowing my own mind, Eleanor replied, exchanging a glance with Caleb. Something I learned from you, Mother. This unexpected acknowledgement seemed to catch Margaret off guard. For a moment, her carefully maintained facade cracked, revealing something vulnerable beneath. I only ever wanted to protect you, she admitted quietly. The world is cruel to those who don't fit its expectations. I know, Eleanor said gently. But sometimes the answer isn't to change yourself to fit the world. Sometimes it's finding the place and people who value you as you are. Margaret studied her daughter's face, then looked at Caleb, who stood silently nearby, his usual stoicism softened by something that might have been tenderness. Well, she said briskly, composure recovered, if you're determined to live in the wilderness, we should at least ensure the wedding is civilized. The arch needs more evergreen, and I still haven't decided on the table arrangements. As Margaret returned to her self-appointed duties, Eleanor and Caleb exchanged amused glances. She'll never fully approve, Eleanor murmured. Doesn't need to, Caleb replied, his hand finding hers. Only we do. The wedding day dawned clear and perfect, the mountains sharp against a flawless blue sky. Eleanor stood in her small cabin, now transformed by her mother's efforts into a bridal preparation chamber. Margaret fussed over the wedding dress, another, of Caleb's creations, though he had been forbidden from seeing the final result. He made this? Margaret asked for perhaps the 10th time, adjusting the cream-colored silk with begrudging admiration. Without a pattern, Caleb sees things differently, Eleanor explained, standing patiently as her mother secured tiny wildflowers in her dark hair. Patterns, connections, possibilities others miss. Like he saw in you, Margaret observed with unexpected insight. Yes, Eleanor agreed softly. Exactly like that. The July wedding date approached with the swift certainty of mountain seasons. Under Margaret's determined supervision, the simple ceremony Eleanor and Caleb had envisioned transformed into something more elaborate, though still modest by Philadelphia standards. If I must witness my only daughter marry in the wilderness, Margaret declared, it will at least be done properly. She dispatched letters to Whitefish ordering fabric, flowers and food with the efficiency of a general planning a campaign. Eleanor watched with mixed amusement and alarm as her mother commandeered Mabel's assistance, turning the quiet clearing into a hive of preparation. Your mother is formidable, Mabel commented one afternoon as they arranged wildflowers in the cabin. Makes my late husband's drill sergeant seem gentle by comparison, Eleanor laughed. She's always been this way, determined to bend the world to her vision. I just never expected that vision would include a wedding at Caleb's cabin. Speaking of the groom, Mabel said, lowering her voice though Margaret was occupied outside. How's he handling all this activity? Eleanor glanced toward the window where she could see Caleb chopping wood, his rhythmic movements a stark contrast to the flurry around him. He disappears hunting more often, she admitted, but he's making an effort for my sake. In truth, Caleb had shown remarkable patience with the disruption to his solitary existence. He had wordlessly constructed additional seating for the expected guests, expanded the outdoor cooking area, and even helped clear a larger space in the clearing for what Margaret insisted on calling the reception area. Only at night, when they stole precious moments alone while Margaret slept, did he express his feelings about the growing spectacle. Too much? Eleanor had asked softly one evening, finding him at his usual spot overlooking the valley. Not the marriage, he'd clarified immediately, his arm encircling her waist, just the watching. She understood perfectly. For a man who had retreated from society's gaze after the war, having his private life suddenly thrust into public view was its own kind of battlefield. 3 more weeks, she'd promised, leaning into his solid warmth, then just us again. Now, watching him from the cabin window, Eleanor felt a surge of protective love. Caleb had not only welcomed her into his carefully constructed sanctuary, but was now opening it to others. All for her. The door burst open as Margaret returned, arms filled with evergreen boughs. These will need to be arranged along the path, she announced, and Mr. Wolf should construct an arch where you'll stand for the ceremony. Mother, Eleanor said firmly, Caleb has actual work to do. His business doesn't stop for wedding preparations. Margaret waved a dismissive hand. Nonsense. What business could be more important than ensuring his bride has a proper wedding? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The business that provides our livelihood, Eleanor replied, keeping her tone even. The same business that impressed you enough to soften your opposition to our marriage. Margaret had the grace to look slightly abashed. Well, yes, his enterprise is surprisingly robust. I simply thought... A sharp knock at the door interrupted her, drawing all eyes. Caleb, still outside, straightened from his work, hand instinctively, moving toward the knife at his belt, an old soldier's habit that emerged when surprised. Eleanor moved to the door, opening it to find Thomas Whitley standing on the threshold, looking distinctly uncomfortable. Behind him, another man waited on horseback, a stranger in an expensive coat despite the summer heat. Miss Blackwood, Thomas began stiffly, forgive the intrusion. This gentleman insisted on being brought to see Mr. Wolf immediately on a matter of business. The stranger dismounted, approaching with the confident stride of a man accustomed to deference. Charles Blackwood, he introduced himself with a slight bow. Northern Pacific Railroad. I understand this is the residence of Caleb Wolf. Eleanor's surprise at hearing her own surname quickly gave way to wariness. The railroad's expansion through Montana had been a topic of increasing discussion in Whitefish, with opinions sharply divided on its benefits and costs. I'm Eleanor Blackwood, she replied coolly, Mr. Wolf's fiancée and business partner. How may we assist you? The man's eyebrows rose slightly at her direct manner. I have a proposition that Mr. Wolf might find extremely advantageous. Might I speak with him directly? Caleb had approached silently, his tall figure now looming behind the railroad man. I'm Wolf, he said, his voice deeper than usual, a sign Eleanor recognized as tension. Blackwood turned, momentarily startled by Caleb's imposing presence. Ah, excellent. Mr. Wolf, the Northern Pacific is expanding through this territory. Our surveys indicate that the most viable route passes approximately 2 miles south of this property. Your point? Caleb asked, his economy with words making the question sound more abrupt than intended. We need a reliable supplier of meat for our work crews, Blackwood explained, regaining his composure. Hundreds of men who require feeding for at least 18 months of construction. Your reputation as a hunter and supplier reached our regional office. We're prepared to offer an exclusive contract. Quite lucrative, I assure you. Eleanor watched understanding dawn on Caleb's face. Such a contract would transform his modest enterprise into something much larger, bringing substantial wealth, but also fundamentally changing the nature of his work. Come inside, Eleanor invited, making the decision when Caleb remained silent. We can discuss the details. Around the table, with Margaret observing keenly and Thomas Whitley hovering awkwardly near the door, Blackwood laid out the railroad's proposal. The figures were indeed impressive, far beyond anything their current operation generated. Additionally, Blackwood continued, we'd require you to relocate closer to the construction headquarters in Helena. The company would provide suitable accommodation, of course. Relocate, Eleanor repeated, glancing at Caleb, whose expression had gone completely still. Certainly. The logistics of supply-demand proximity. Helena offers all modern conveniences, quite an improvement over this. Blackwood gestured vaguely at the cabin. Rustic situation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Margaret, who had been uncharacteristically silent, suddenly spoke. That sounds like a tremendous opportunity, Mr. Blackwood. My daughter and her future husband would naturally prefer civilization to this wilderness. Mother, Eleanor warned, but Caleb's hand on her arm stopped further protest. Need time, he said to Blackwood, to consider. The railroad man nodded, though his expression suggested he had expected immediate acceptance. Of course, I'll remain. In Whitefish for 3 days, Mr. Whitley has kindly offered accommodation at his establishment. Thomas, who had been watching Eleanor throughout the conversation, stepped forward. I'd be happy to facilitate any communication between Mr. Wolfe and the railroad. As a businessman myself, I understand the importance of such decisions. After the visitors departed, tension filled the cabin. Margaret could barely contain her excitement, pacing the small space with renewed energy. This changes everything, she declared. Helena is a proper city. You could have a real home there, Eleanor. Not this. She waved at the cabin that had been Eleanor's sanctuary for months. This is our home, Eleanor replied quietly, watching. Caleb, who had moved to stand by the window, his back to them, shoulders rigid. Don't be ridiculous. It was a temporary solution to your unfortunate circumstances. Now Providence has provided a far better option. Caleb, Eleanor said, ignoring her mother, what are you thinking? He turned slowly, his face showing the struggle. Within, when he spoke, his words came more freely than usual, as if the importance of the moment demanded the effort.